The Ford Sociological Department would also be sent to invade the personal lives of the workers to investigate the cleanliness of their homes in KGB like fashion. They would grill the workers to find out whether they sent money back to anyone back home, if they were really married, did the foreign culture out of immigrants. After two failed inspections of a worker was fired. That level of invasion of privacy and social engineering would be unheard of in today's world. Henry Ford eventually embarked on a massive public relations campaign, even going to the lengths of establishing the Ford Motion Picture Department to produce in house features. It was in 1914 that they released their first movie in theaters titled How Henry Ford Makes 1,000 Cars a Day. The self promoting film presented Ford as a simple everyman with simple taste. Henry Ford was portrayed as hardworking like his workers and a plain man that just likes to work on his farm. The real Henry Ford was a peculiar dichotomy. He was a very wealthy man and was often photographed with his many celebrity friends, and yet he enjoyed a reputation in the press as the everyman industrialist. This treatment would cause the ego of Henry Ford to grow. When it came to dealing with his employees, their desk would have simply disappeared. Milton from Office Space. Ford came in to enjoy the power that he held over others, a position that would swell his own self importance and convince him that his own judgment and opinions were impeccable and rose to be and not to be questioned. The Ford Motor Company changes hands. Henry Ford begrudgingly handed over the Ford Motor Company to his son Edsel in 1918, but that was far from the last time he would be involved in the decision making process. Ford would retain a high level of control in the company, eventually even tricking the stockholders into selling their shares to him and Edsel, which placed the control of the company back in the hands of the Ford family. Truly, Henry Ford would let Edsel only ostensibly run the company while he continued to control and manipulate every aspect and even take the opportunity to humiliate Edsel from time to time. The 1920s in America were full of change. There were youthful music, dancing clubs, and prohibition. The change was all over the roadways. There were suddenly so many cars where there had been virtually none before. The roadways were often clogged and congested. But this new era brought an enormous amount of change. The automobile industry boom fueled the rubber and oil industries, created gas stations, roadside motels, restaurants, and of course, the inevitable road construction and expansion. The sudden boom and use of the car changed vacation habits and even the way cities were set up. The younger generation had embraced the idea of the car as a tool of leisure and escape. A fact that the old fashioned thinker Henry Ford wasn't fond of. The new generation of consumers would demand more detailed and flashy cars, along with new features. The roaring 20s were full of flash and style, a trend that Ford had no intention of carrying over into his own vehicles. The flagrant consumerism seemed to make him uncomfortable. The American of a generation ago was a shrewd buyer, Ford said, but nowadays the American people seem to listen and be sold. Ford ignored the new marketplace, and the inevitable happened. Sales began to fall. The sales of Chevy GM, by contrast, had tripled and were available in a variety of fresh new colors. Ford didn't want to make anything but the Model T. He held strong to the idea that his own vision was all that mattered, and it began to hold him back in the marketplace. The Model T had already become obsolete in the new world. Ford asserted, the only problem with a Ford car is that we can't produce it fast enough. Edsel Ford saw the need to make some major changes and finally went toe to toe with his father. The sleek Ford Model A was the first Ford car to be available on an installment plan. Edsel was behind it, but Ford took the credit in the press. Edsel had to push to get it made. The Model A received the company's sales with 700,000 cars sold in the first year alone. The relationship between Henry Ford and his son soured at this point and would never properly recover. Henry couldn't face that his baby, the Model T, was now obsolete. But the country was going through a major period of change. Rural America began to disappear as more people were living in cities than on the farm. The 1929 stock market crash deeply affected the city of Detroit and the auto industry. A wave of poverty and unemployment began to move across the country, and soon the consumer was no longer there. In 4 years, the automobile marketplace lost 90% of its previous business. Ford tried to keep the workers solvent and raised wages to $7 per day, but Model A sales weren't there anymore, so the layoffs came. The mayor of Detroit, Frank Murphy, estimated in the early 1930s that a third of the 200,000 people in the bread lines were laid off by Ford's factories alone. Unemployed citizens would wait hours for just a small ration of bread during the difficult economic times. The former employees of Ford were hungry and would even take to the streets with other unemployed workers in hunger marches. An article published in Fortune at the time noted that declining sales have changed Mr. Ford from one of the greatest U.S. moneymakers to one of the greatest money losers. Ironically, the very same Fortune magazine would name Henry Ford as Businessman of the Century in 1999. Henry Ford and the unions. Henry Ford hated the idea of a labor union. He hated that they were a challenge to his power and his absolute authority over the way he chose to run his factory. Ford employed a young man named Henry Bennett, an ex-Navy man, to control the River Rogue factory with his gang of armed toughs that kept strict grips on the employees. Bennett was a small man at only 5'7" and weighing a spry 145. Ford wanted the 24-year-old to act as his muscle at the Rogue factory. The men there were gritty and tough to manage, and Ford needed someone who answered directly to him that could strong arm the employees into subservience. Bennett wasn't a disappointment. He and his men ruled the plant with an iron fist and loaded weapons. Bennett kept a basement of office at the Rogue, which included a secret door that could be opened by using a button underneath his desk. In his secret room, Bennett and Ford would have their meetings with a guarantee of the utmost privacy. Bennett was a company man through and through, once boasting, "I am Mr. Ford's personal man." His dedication to Henry Ford was second to none. If Mr. Ford told me to blacken out the sun tomorrow, I might have trouble fixing it. But you'd see 100,000 sons of bitches coming through the roof gates in the morning, all wearing dark glasses. Bennett played the role of a gentleman gangster, recruiting a variety of athletes, ex-military, and even ex-cons to his Ford Enforcement Department, dubbed the Service Department. The men, adorned with suits, fedoras, and guns, used the threat of physical violence to keep the workforce in check. The rules in the factories became strict and overbearing. The workers weren't allowed to talk to each other or even sit down. The workers became accustomed to the absurd rules that they even learned to speak to each other without moving their lips, hoping to avoid a beating at the hands of Bennett and his men. The workers referred to it as the Fordization of the face.